Okay, this lesson is about taxes and spending and the hard choices that cities and states have to make. So the anti-tax movement really gets kicked off here in California with Prop 13 in 1978. At the time in California, property taxes in particular were challenging because the amount of real estate, the value of real estate was escalating so quickly. And it meant that many seniors were forced to sell their homes because they were no longer able to afford the property tax. So if you buy your house for $15,000 and now your house is worth $150,000, basically your taxes have gone up. Um, your taxes were 10% of what they are now. When you bought the house, they were 10% of what they are now. And so, because of these escalating property taxes, especially those on fixed incomes, could no longer afford their homes. The other kind of things to have to consider with this is that at the time, the state was running a huge surplus. And the both the federal and state governments had embarked on large social services programming in the name of the Great Lyndon Johnson's Great Society. In addition, in California, you have this weird relationship between Prop 13 and Serrano versus Priest. Serrano versus Priest was a California state Supreme Court ruling that said that if local property taxes went to local schools and the amount of money going to local schools on a per pupil basis varied greatly between school districts, that was a fundamental unequal situation and therefore not permitted by the state constitution. And so basically at the same time that you have Serrano versus Priest going into effect, you have Prop 13 going into effect. And what Serrano versus Priest did was it meant that all of the property tax revenue went to Sacramento, and then the portion designated for K-12 education was reallocated back to the school districts on a pure per pupil basis. So between Prop 13 and Serrano, the relationship between Sacramento and the municipalities changed, leaving municipalities with a lot less flexibility over spending. So if you want to be a policy entrepreneur, basically you want to create new services, do things differently, Prop 13 really limits your ability to do this. And so at this point, municipalities are almost entirely service providers using the money generated by the revenues from the state transfers between the state government and the municipalities, and including the regulations that come with that. Um, the over time, this lack of flexibility meant a cut in services and funding both at the state and municipal level. The other thing it did was shift the tax share toward the income tax over the property tax. So in California, we get a much, much larger percent of our um, um, state budget from income taxes than they do in most states, and this is a percentage. This also means that in good times, California does well because we have a lot of wealthy people and they make a lot of money. If you think of like Silicon Valley. But in recessions, the wealthy are affected. Their income is affected more than the poor. There's not a whole lot to cut with the poor and working class. If it's not like if you're paying somebody minimum wage, you can go out and replace them with somebody who makes less, for instance. Because of this, when so 45% of our California tax comes from the top 1% of our earners. Because of this, when there are recessions, California is hit much harder than most states because we are income tax dependent, and when people's income drops, it affects our overall budget. In addition, in this last Congress, the Congress did a major overhaul of taxes. In general, they tended to lower personal and corporate taxes. However, a big thing that hit California, New Jersey, New York, these states with high income earners is that they put a cap on the amount of state and local taxes you could deduct from your federal tax bill, and that tax was $10,000. So in a place like Kansas, when the average home price is $100,000, and the average salary is much lower, the vast majority of people spend less than $10,000 on state and local taxes. Whereas in California, there are many people who spend more than $10,000 in state and local property income, et cetera, taxes. And so the SALT deduction is also having an impact on how California deals with taxes, but this is also true in states with high income and high property values as well. It's not just a California thing. Then when we have the Great Recession, we have another kind of instance of an impact on taxes and services. So we have this first hit in 78, and then another hit in 2008. And so the Great Recession caused dramatic decrease in state and local tax revenue across the country. However, the government stepped in with a stimulus bill, and a lot of state and local spending since the Great Recession has been transfers from the federal government. Just like the transfers when municipalities began to rely on the state, that came with strings attached. Now states are starting to depend increasingly on the federal government. Again, more and more strings attached to that spending. And so in the Great Recession, 34 states cut their K through 12 education, 43 states cut their higher education budgets, 31 cut their healthcare budgets, 29 cut the services to the elderly, and 44 of the 50 states reduced employee compensation. And so contracts were renegotiated, and there was a general freeze on hiring. And we can see that over time, just as the budgets were shrinking, demands for many types of services were going up. And so the big one was unemployment insurance, which the federal government pays a portion of, but the states pay a large percent of. And so the percent of people needing this goes up dramatically. And also the demands on Medicaid and public colleges go up, but it's less dramatic. And all of this, the Great Recession caused states and cities to reassess a bunch of different things. They reassess their total budget. Are we making enough money? Are we spending too much money? Things like that. It also caused states across the country to reassess their tax structures. What who they're taxing and in what amounts. It also required states to reassess what services they offer and whether or not they need to continue to provide those services. And it also had them reassess employee contracts and contracts with other businesses and contracted things. And so not all of this was a cut. Some of it in the reassessment was we're going to shift some services that we used to provide in-house. We're going to pay another company to do those um, services. It also meant that, it was a time of great rethinking. We're going to, in the next video, talk about how this affects one particular sector over time, and that's college. But I think we'll get to that in the next video.